I want to start, if I can, and then Sam and I will get engaged in the conversation. And I'm the curator of this show here, and Sam is the curator of the John Hoyland estate and has come over from London specifically for this conversation and to see the show. I want to take some things that Kate said. One of the things that's very interesting, I think, about Rothko is that he's an extraordinary restless figure, both biographically and in terms of his art. As Kate went through his art, one can see him shifting, remaking, rethinking. You know, he's in America, but he's looking to European surrealism. He's in America, but he's looking to a great Florentine library. These are not, he's not a figure who's very simple, who finds belonging very easy. It's very interesting. I've been to the Dominial Chapel twice. And one of the things I've always found very interesting is that it's full of Buddhist monks who come. And of course, someone once glibly said of Rothko's paintings that they were Zen television. And I think the issue of spirituality is very important. Kate made a distinction between religion and spirituality, and I think she was right to do so. So I want to begin, if I can, by just some observations about how both Hoyland and Rothko, but in different ways, have been restless artists. Restless being a term of valuation rather than a criticism. If you go back to the beginnings of abstraction, and both artists, both John Hoyland and Mark Rothko, in the end became famous for their abstraction. If you go back to the beginning, you go back to Kandinsky's, you know, a Russian who lived in Germany and then went to live in France. You go back to Kandinsky's great treatise called On the Spiritual in Art. And Kandinsky was very influenced, to use that 19th century language, by Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer did nothing but read Chinese philosophy for a long time. So from Chinese philosophy via Russian, via Germany, it gets very complicated when one's thinking about how things begin. And the most interesting for me, who spends a lot of my time in China, is after Mao Zedong dies in 76, because no one's allowed to translate anything in Chinese during Mao's time. In 1981, Kandinsky's treatise is translated into Chinese. And Kandinsky becomes a very important figure in the emergence of Chinese abstraction. So Schopenhauer begins by translating out of Chinese into European culture, and the Chinese end by translating Kandinsky into Chinese. The circulation of knowledge is extraordinarily complex. And it's that leads us, I suppose, for us to begin to think of Hoyland's own restlessness. You go downstairs, you see calligraphy. You see paintings that looks explicitly, if it is engaged with Rothko. You see all kinds of different shapes. So we want to begin, and I suppose this is what I want to begin by asking Sam about Hoyland's own relationship with Mark Rothko.
So Rothko, in a way, Hoyland's relationship with Rothko sort of bookends his entire career. So the first and the last statements we have by Hoyland both concern Rothko. So in 1961, he was interviewed by the great historian of abstract expressionism, Irving Sandler. So almost exactly the same time as he'd just seen the Rothko exhibition at the Whitechapel. And there he spoke about his beginning to think about Rothko. And I think at that point, his main reaction was that he was completely overwhelmed by the work. He saw it as completely alien, completely absolute, and something which he almost could not understand. And at that moment, he was only beginning, in a way, his education in art. So he said it only occurred to him much later that there was a relationship to Matisse, that there was a relationship to Rembrandt, that Rothko had actually come out of a previous history and was not just this completely unexplainable set of images. And then fast forward, 60 years, and only a matter of weeks before Hoyland died, he was interviewed by the Whitechapel Gallery in relation to the 60th anniversary of that Rothko exhibition at the Whitechapel, and again sort of reaffirmed the importance of Rothko to him as an artist. Another interesting aspect of this is that first interview with Irving Sandler, he spoke about Rothko in a sort of very formal sense. So I think that's the beginning of him trying to understand Rothko. So he said, I'm following Rothko in a sense of the formal organization of my paintings. So at that time, Hoyland was painting vertical paintings which had horizontal elements. And I think those were the very first, immature in a way, fumblings of Hoyland to try and understand Rothko. And then right at the end of his life, where there's two magnificent paintings downstairs, Winter Tiger and Elegy for Terry Frost, Hoyland began much more self-consciously in a way to think about spirituality, to think about the void, and this was prompted by a sense of his own mortality and a sense, and the fact that a lot of his friends had died in recent years, in those last 10 years of Hoyland's own life. And so there's a formal aspect at the beginning, there's a sort of spirituality at the end, and in the middle, Hoyland sort of struggled with the idea of how to advance beyond Rothko. So he said that Rothko created these amazing, luminous, somber images. I think in relation to what Kate said about whether they were tragic or celebratory, I think Hoyland was probably, particularly at the beginning, was one of those artists who saw them as luminous and not obviously happy, but as celebrations of life. And I think that's where he came in and how he developed. Just one more thing. He said his worry was that for all the greatness of Rothko, for artists that came after him, he had closed the door. And so I think a lot of Hoyland's later production can be seen as a way of trying to work with this sort of absolute images that Rothko had made and to still try and develop his own abstract language in the wake of what Rothko had achieved.
There's a great quotation by Hamlet, which I wish I could speak it in Latvian. I wish I could speak anything in Latvian. is by indirection, find direction out. And I think that's what Hoyland did, as it were, finding himself confronted by Rothko. He went elsewhere. And one of the things before, when thinking about this exhibition, was to look at John's library, John Hoyland's library, and see how many books on Asian art, on Asian philosophy, on Chinese poetry, on Japanese ink painting, on Zen are part of his library. And it seems to me one of the dimensions that Hoyland went to was to go to Asian iconography and to Asian beliefs in order to get back around Rothko. And there is a historian of abstraction who said generally that it is simply impossible to understand the emergence of abstraction without understanding philosophy from Asia, which is what takes us back to Schopenhauer and to Kandinsky. But of course, this is to speak of John Hoyland at this, what one might call, art historical level. There's also a boy who's born in 1934, who's born, as it were, and grows up in the immediate post-war period. And this is a very important moment because Kate mentioned the surrealists after the Second World War, how important they became in America, but actually most of them had gone to America because of the Second World War. So I suppose I'm as interested, Sam, how do you think he lived in the 50s?
Well, when he went to London in '56 to study at the Royal Academy, and one of his tutors, he won a scholarship for a very early painting, and one of his tutors said to him that he could spend it travelling to the south of France and to Italy, and he said, "Go and play in the sunshine, boy." And that, I think, became an important aspect of the rest of Hoyland's life. And he joked that as a boy in post-war Sheffield, which was a very industrial city, he wasn't aware of the seasons until he was about 12, because everything was just grey and dark and smog-like. And I think all the way through his life, from that moment, from those first travels to the south of France and to Italy, he sought out bright sunshine, light, to him, exotic cultures. That was a hugely important part of his life all the way through.
And it's also true to complement that European imagination. Of course, the 50s is the moment when America rules the world, largely literally as well as metaphorically, not least culturally, when a number of big exhibitions from America come and kind of dislodge British painting, which was rather small, rather modest, landscape-focused. And in fact, the inventor of the British Arts Council, a great economist called Keynes, who was there in the Versailles Agreement after the First World War, said they'd invented the Arts Council with the adage, "Death to Hollywood." So one of the things that was important in the 50s, seems to me, is that America was, weirdly enough for English working class boys, and in certain ways not, Hoyland was working class, it became a kind of badge of honor to identify yourself with these big, brash, vulgar people and artists in America. And I think the American connection at that period can't be overestimated. Terry Frost, who's been here, and Gillian Ayres, both British artists who I've shown here, were also bowled over by what one might call the American connection. Now, as we look back, we can see more British connections than they would admit at the time. But I think one of the things that's extraordinary about Hoyland is very much that he's artistically very promiscuous. I don't know how you say promiscuous in Latvian, but he would steal from anywhere. He would steal from Asia. He would steal from Matisse or Miro. He would steal from America. And I think the interesting thing then is why he did it. And in the 90s, he did speak that art had to be spiritual. And it's interesting that the Rothko exhibition here has a quotation where Mark Rothko says, "My art, if you want the sacred and if you want the profane, they are both here." Do you think it's true, Sam, that spirituality was important to John?
Yes, I think spirituality was a big part of his work. I think it's interesting you were saying about the kind of attraction of America, because I think that sense of the glamour of America to a young boy at that time was hugely important. And I also think that sense of glamour was something, or sort of stylishness and worldliness was something that Hoyland had as part of his work, and that kind of was always in competition with a sense of spirituality, or he was in a way a sensualist as much as a spiritualist, and he made that distinction in relation to his art and that of Rothko's. David Ampham, in a recent, who's obviously did the catalogue raisonné of Rothko, recently wrote on Hoyland's late paintings for a show we did a couple of years ago to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of Hoyland's death. And he picked up on an anecdote that Hoyland had told about visiting Rothko's studio. And which was at the time It was probably in '64 at the beginning, and he remembered the murals being painted there. And there was a number of different lessons he took from this meeting, one of which was the struggle that Rothko was undergoing. And Hoyland was very conscious that he was struggling with the colour, with the composition, with how big the pictures were to be, with their format, with everything was a worry to him and something he wasn't resolving. And Hoyland, at that moment, was 30, and he was visiting with another young friend of his, an artist called Paul Huxley. And Rothko brought up an exhibition of William de Kooning drawings of women. And then he said to Paul Huxley and Hoyland, and what do you think about in the afternoons? And they were very kind of slightly perplexed by this. And Rothko then said to him, the mornings are fine. I get to the studio, I look at the paintings, I might sweep the studio, lie down, have a nap. But in the afternoon, I get to thinking about flesh. And then he said, I suppose you young boys just go out and get it. And I think this, and David Ampham's essay picked apart these two aspects, this sort of sensuality and the spirituality, the background of, we can imagine those mural paintings with those thoughts at the same time. And I think Hoyland really, that in a way, much of Hoyland's art can be expressed as a combination of those two things.
What I would call body and soul, which is, I think, the terms in effect that Rothko is thinking about. But of course, the great thing about the word flesh, it's not meat, it's flesh. Lucian Freud does meat. Rothko and Hoyland do flesh. His flesh has two meanings. It's both got a spiritual dimension, since in Jewish as much as in Christian languages, we are incarnated. So we are at that level, flesh spiritually. But we also flesh in the sense of sexual desire, in the sense that we're animals and are going in the end to pass away. So that tension, I think, is important. And it's certainly what I've tried to structure in the exhibition downstairs, to try, as it were, to do disruptive rooms in which one room is then contradicted by the next room and then contradicted. So there is no nice development of John Hoyland. It really is a kind of disruptive experience which is incarnated in those two meanings of the word flesh. Now, we've already spoken for 20 minutes, and I'll never hold it against Kate that she spoke for much longer. No, I'm joking. So I think if there are questions, probably either to Kate or ourselves at this stage, and you've had the Hoyland work scrolling behind you, since you need to eat at some stage, because that's what flesh needs. It needs food. If there are questions, we'd be very happy to respond to them. It's been a long morning. So there's a question.
Are there anybody in Britain now who would be considered to be new John Hoyland?
So I don't know if you heard that. Is there anybody in Britain today who one could consider the new John Hoyland?
One of the interesting things that's happening at the moment in London, I think internationally as well, is that there has been a sort of resurgence in abstract painting amongst younger artists in their 20s and 30s. And maybe a generation ago in the 90s, anyone who had a public profile and painted abstract paintings did so with very much a sense that abstraction was a kind of closed book. And so the only way to approach it was sort of through irony. But I think there's quite a number of younger painters who, whether or not they're often surprisingly conscious of Hoyland, and we've had a few visitors in the studio who are painting abstract paintings sort of directly without a sense that they are picking over a kind of dead language. We had a painter called Harminder Judge, who makes very beautiful paintings which are sort of made of plaster and have this wonderful kind of rich, almost sublime sense. And I saw a show a couple of days ago, just before I came here, of a painter called Emily Krauss, who's American, but showing and working in the UK. Whether or not you could see her as the next John Hoyland, she's certainly engaging with and sort of extending the language of abstract expressionism, I would guess, in the most general sense. So yeah, there are some.
I think there are, but I think the thing that none of us has mentioned, and we should, because it is, as the English say, the elephant in the room, is the market. So the market, so Gagosian, the biggest gallery in the world, is going to do a global abstract expression across several galleries. And of course, Gagosian has just said everything has to be figurative, figurative, figurative. Everything has to be abstract, abstract, abstract. In other words, the market pressures on generating novelty should never be underestimated. In a sense, the Seagram mural story is a sense of Marx saying, which I always think is an extraordinary comment, it's risky to send a painting into, you know, and the whole of the 20th century, if you listen to that great Polish novelist, Joseph Conrad, whenever his people try to tell a story, nobody wants to listen to them. They always fall asleep, the audiences in Conrad's novels. It's risky to try to engage because the market is so powerful. And part of the pleasure, if I might put it, of coming to here is the market hasn't quite stretched it. It'll come. It'll come. Do you know, it'll certainly be in Warsaw any moment now, and it's already moving to Budapest. So it will be here, don't worry. But this feels a place where art can be valued for reasons other than the market. London's always struggling between the flesh of the spirit and the flesh of money. Are there other questions? Sorry.
I don't want to, you know, it's interesting. I find that Hoyland and Huxley came to my father's studio and were interested in abstraction because when I think of what was going on in New York at that time, which was pop art and beginning minimalism, I wonder, was this something that they had some interest in and were learning about as well and made a decision they wanted to go in one direction or another, or was it something that really wasn't on the British radar at the time, so it wasn't, you know, something they were coming to interact with in a sense?
Well, I think obviously in New York they were cycling through all these different tendencies very, very quickly, and there was a time lag in them arriving in the UK. So there's not that sort of sense that they become immediately obsolete when the next thing comes along. I mean, there was a strong pop tendency, you know, the early paintings by David Hockney and the crowd at the RCA were happening at the same time, and Hoyland was not interested. So they had these amazing exhibitions of American abstract painting in the late 50s and in the early 60s, and I think they were still struggling with those, with working through their experiences in those exhibitions, rather than the feeling that might be in New York that those things had already passed, that had already become past.
Although
Things move so quickly.
yeah.
I mean,
Although let me say, to be fair to England, which I'm often not fair to, you know, the first use of pop art is actually in England in 1952 by an Italian-Scots artist called Edoardo Paolozzi, and Richard Hamilton, who became an important figure. So actually, English pop art was there in the 50s. So by the time John was a student, he could have chosen, if I might put it the way, that road, but he chose a different one. And there was a big struggle, you know, in Britain during the period of certainly in 56, when John was sort of a student, between being a realist painter, which meant often being a communist, which John Berger was, being an abstractionist, which often meant St. Ives School, Terry Frost, and then would later be developed by people like Gillian and John, or being a pop artist. So there were conflicts, and I think, oddly enough, now America isn't as powerful as it once was. All those other histories can now be looked at again, which is the reason I think the show in Riga at the moment of the 80s Latvian art, for a foreigner like me, is a very interesting show. It's called Dismantle the Wall, and it's about the work that was produced, as it were, as the Soviet Empire began to collapse. And my sense is post-war East European art, the market will discover quite soon. And that will be good and bad. It'll be good because the market will give it visibility. It'll be bad because the market only wants certain things it can sell. Anything else? Or you're free for lunch? Who votes for lunch? Anything else? Could I thank then Sam and obviously Kate, and thank you all for staying for 2 hours. Thank you very much.